I am so happy to be here with you this morning. In the last week or so, I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback about this podcast where I interview bright minds. And so let's call it the Brightest Minds podcast. And I'm going to take some time to dive into some conversations with some really experienced, intelligent, successful people. And in episode 3 today, I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. Matthew Sowcik from the University of Florida. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me on here, Kris.
No, it's really my pleasure. And, I'm so excited about the opportunity to share more about the Matt Sowcik story. You're a leadership coach, you're a professor at the University of Florida. Tell us a little bit more about your backstory. And if you don't mind, you do have a tie here to my hometown in northeastern Pennsylvania. So I'd love to hear about that, what you did here, and then ultimately how you ended up at the University of Florida.
Yeah, Kris, thank you so much. I actually have a strong tie to northeastern Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in Dallas, Pennsylvania, so not too far from Wilkes-Barre, and had a chance to go to Wilkes University. After that, went to a couple of different places, Columbia University, Gonzaga University, but always found my way back to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and taught for a number of years at Wilkes University, running their leadership programs, working in the business school, and certainly making great friendships with people like yourself, and talking about this thing that I'm just tremendously passionate about: leadership development, leadership education. And now a couple of years ago, decided that I was going to take an opportunity at the University of Florida, just the most amazing place to work, have wonderful colleagues who really kind of support this idea of leadership development, doing really good work, good research, and certainly going out and helping organizations like the one that you run and many others throughout the nation.
Yeah, no, I've always, we're going to get into this idea of whether or not leadership is about experience, whether it's a learned skill or whatnot. But before we get there, it was about a little over a year ago, I read this book called The $1 Trillion Coach, and it profiled this individual by the name of Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell has coached Silicon Valley visionaries like Steve Jobs, Larry Page, and Eric Schmidt. And for folks that are watching this that think that, you've had a successful career or otherwise that, you consider yourself a good manager or a good leader, when I read that book, the thing that struck me was that I consider Eric Schmidt and Larry Page and Steve Jobs to be like the ultimate leaders and managers. So what were these guys doing with this infamous, really coach by the name of Bill Campbell? And so I was inspired and I thought to myself, I would like to have a coach, and who would be the best coach that I could find to not only be my personal coach, but to ultimately coach my teams that I invest in. And so for those that are watching, Matt Sowcik is my coach, and we do regular sessions where Matt and I are working on a number of things to try to improve my leadership and management skill. But Matt, talk a little bit more about what you've done for LSEO, because yes, you've been my coach, but you also are the coach of our entire company. So talk a little bit more about what you've done for us.
Yeah, I think, and really, those are very kind words. And I do think this idea of coaching is a really important one. I think this idea of lifelong learning is a really important one. And when you talk about some of the great leaders, Steve Jobs is a great example of it. He talks about this idea of humility, and we may talk about humility a little bit later in this session, but he talks about humility as really being important as a lesson he learned in his life to be able to become a really great leader, that he had great ideas, he was really innovative, but to really drive and move Apple forward, it was this humility that worked. And out of that humility came this idea of having a coach and having someone that you could bounce ideas, someone who would be really honest with you and certainly bring about not only the things you're doing really well, but in a really kind of creative way allow people to dive into some of their opportunities for exploration and knowing more about their self-awareness, and maybe even some of the areas that they're ignorant about, not knowing what they don't know in that process. So I'm very blessed to be able to work with you in that and talk through this. When I talk a little bit about the company and LSCEO, I think to provide leadership development training, engage people at where they are, and kind of move them through that process. It has so many impacts, cultural impacts. The company that had a great culture that went to have an extraordinary culture over a couple months of just doing this coaching and engaging in it. I think it allows people to feel more free about taking chances and risks on where they want their career to go. And probably the best part about it is just seeing this idea that humility and leadership and development are things that people can learn over a period of time. And if we put some goals to that and hold people accountable, we would for numbers or metrics or return on investment. If we put those same accountability steps into place, people really can kind of achieve that next level for themselves.
In thinking through leadership and honestly, the impact that you've had on me and on this company over the last year has been testament to the progress that we've made, the awards that we've won for best places to work, et cetera. But, in thinking through this idea of leadership, leaders, there are certain people that just have a desire for leadership, right? And I think that in and of itself is a conversation. There are people who have experience as leaders or as managers, and I think there's a conversation about that, how you could acquire it through experience. But the piece of it that you have demonstrated for LSEO and for me, which in my opinion is profound, is leadership and management skill acquisition. So thinking about leadership and management as a skill that could be attained or acquired and that can be improved. And so, as a professor at the University of Florida and, having been, a leadership coach and, an academic on this, is there a particular school of thought that you've adopted? Have you kind of devised your own? When you're coming into an organization like LSEO, what curriculum or paradigm or platform do you come in with?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think, what we kind of discussed in education or higher education over the last 20 years, 30 years, since leadership has become kind of a discipline, a way of studying this process, is that we moved from this idea that leaders were born to leaders could be made, that you could actually use all collective experiences and build out, like you said, structure kind of a scaffolding of a curriculum that would allow people at different points to kind of elevate their leadership ability. So that's what I try to do, is I try to meet an organization where they're at. And as you know, that means addressing management and leaders who have had that experience in a different way than maybe new emerging leaders or individuals who just started in the organization, and treating those a little bit differently, allowing people to take those steps very purposefully and intentionally so that they can learn their leadership. And throughout that process, you try to build upon the skills that people have. So you really start and make sure you're paying attention to self-awareness at first, and in the purpose that people have, knowing their why and why they would be involved with leadership, and then moving out to understanding their relational ability. How can they build relationships? How do they understand the importance of people? And then finally getting to kind of the best practices of leadership, understanding context and how they're leading in a particular context. And if you build those skills and abilities each step of the way, they'll find confidence in their ability to lead. They'll find confidence in the relationships they build, and eventually really start to see everything kind of pay out if you hold it accountable once again, and you have some process for measuring people's development. And that's what we've tried to do. And I think your folks specifically kind of came in with that hunger to learn leadership, and then just really kind of devoured each episode that I gave, each assignment that I allowed them to see, and really participated to the fullest, which changed the culture and certainly, I think, helped them lead not only better at LSEO, but in their lives, in their personal lives. Many times I heard them talk about having better relationships with their spouse or their significant other or in their community. And that's really what I love about the leadership process, is it's kind of a holistic process where it's not just at work, it's in the communities where they live, and certainly with the families that they care so much about.
So we were able to gain access to your curriculum, if you will, because you do have a private practice, correct? Outside of being a professor.
Yeah, I try to stay engaged as much as I can with organizations that are out there. Certainly, mainline is teaching. That's my main focus, is educating students and providing extracurriculars for our extension programs and that sort of stuff. But it would be hollow to me to not take theory and help to understand how it impacts practical organizations like yourself. So where I can, I try to pick and choose really good companies to work for, and yours was an easy selection to decide to kind of engage with, especially based on our relationship and our past history. It was just something I knew I wanted to be part of, and real easy to train people who want to be trained. So.
No, that's cool. So for any CEOs or executives looking to bring on, someone like Matt, you could reach out to him to get more information. But because you're so exclusive and because you only have so much time for this kind of stuff, can you recommend one or two or three different either books or individuals that you would recommend that others can start self-educating on this idea of leadership and management skill acquisition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often get that, is what books are the best to kind of move forward with. And I have some that I tend to give in a situation like this. I'm a big fan of Jim Collins' stuff. I think that's a good start with Good to Great. It talks a lot about determination, and once again, this idea of humility and how you build off of that. But the truth is, there's so many resources out there. The best way to go about it is figure out what you're interested in. With a lot of what's going on in the world today, this idea of justice and racial equality, if you're interested in that and you want to know how to contribute and lead through that, there are great books out there that you can do. There's great, programs that will allow you to engage with that stuff. I think what we do really well in education is we help people find those resources in a quicker amount of time. So certainly contact me. If I don't know the answer, I can certainly provide answers of where do you want to find your curriculum? What are the best things you should be watching? Because the truth is, as many resources that are out there, there are equally as many resources that probably are not as helpful or are coming from one perspective. So being able to help people find the educational resources is really what we do in academia, and certainly as a coach, what I'm best at.
Super cool. So I want to get to humility in just a second.
Please.
But why don't you kind of just share a kind of an insider tip that my team has gotten to experience. And it's this idea early in your curriculum, when Matt comes into your organization, he sort of comes in and it's sort of a modular based online type of system. And there was this idea of golf balls. And we were walking around the office after we all went through that video module, and we were all like, what are your golf balls? We got to figure out what our golf balls are. So you share a little bit more with the audience about what that means.
Yeah, I love that. That's one of my favorite videos. It was something that kind of dawned on me a few years back as I was talking a little bit about priorities in leadership. And how do I explain priorities in leadership? That's one of the more difficult issues that leaders face as they grow, as they gain more power in an organization, more responsibility in an organization. How you prioritize things becomes really important. So the story goes is a philosophy teacher, and many people might know this story, but a philosophy teacher comes in and says, a bucket here, fills it up with golf balls and says, is it full now? And the students in the class say, no, yeah, of course it's full. It's all the way to the top. All the golf balls fill it up. And he then takes out some rocks, some pebbles, and he fills those pebbles in between the holes in those golf balls. And he says, how about now? Is it filled? And the students say, yes, absolutely. There's no more room. And then he takes some sand out and he pours it up to the top, in between the holes between the golf balls and those pebbles. And he finally takes out a cup of coffee or a beer, and he pours the beer and says, how about now? Is it full? And kind of the lesson in that, or what we talked about in the company, was how are you ultimately seeing your golf balls, your rocks, or your pebbles, your sand in this process. And we define that as those golf balls are those things that really bring meaning to the culture and they bring meaning to your leadership. So those ideas that you have to reinvent yourself or opportunities to sit down with people and brainstorm new ways to move forward. I know, especially in your company, that's so important for you. It's one of your values is to continue to reinvent yourself, reinvent the market that you're in. So how are you taking time out once a week to be able to do that? And I love that about what you guys do. Or how are you having lunch with an employee to find out a little bit more? We do that appreciative inquiry interview. And if you have any questions about that, if you're watching this, please, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But it's this idea of sitting down and finding out the best of people so you can grow those relationships. How are you taking on those golf balls? Because what tends to happen is the golf balls often compete with things like these pebbles, which are the everyday duties that you have, or the sand, which are those emergencies. And what people tend to do is they fill their bucket up or they fill their week up with sand, emergencies, pop up, running around, Wild West, trying to solve all these problems. And if you fill the whole bucket up with sand, you never have time for those golf balls. So it was great. I love that the organization was walking around saying, hey, what's your golf balls? How do we engage in these golf balls? How do we put them at the first part of our day? Because we know there's going to be sand and we know that there's going to be pebbles that fill up our bucket. And I think out of that came a great culture of people who were doing amazing things, having, you have a number of employees who are really creative in the way that they build culture. And I've always been in awe at how they kind of move out, feel really comfortable, and take those risks to build that great relationship. I think it says a lot about your leadership, but also the culture that you have. And people are building golf balls all the time at the LSEO.
It's awesome. It's awesome. So let's chat about humility. What is humility and why is it important in leadership and management?
Yeah, so I got invested in this idea of humility from a research standpoint probably about 10 years ago when I was working at Wilkes University. For a number of reasons. I mentioned Jim Collins' book really had an impact on me, kind of suggesting, it's funny, it's been sold in hundreds of places, tens of hundreds of countries. It's been written into a number of different languages. It's sold millions and millions of copies. And it basically kind of boils down to this idea that leaders need to have these, what he calls level 5 leaders, determination, which I couldn't agree more, and humility. And if you have those two things, it really sets you apart. So exploring this rabbit hole of humility, I started to do more research and find that there's these strong connections between humility and lifelong learning, listening, generosity, being able to build great cultures, and it actually academic achievement, innovation, and it just started going from there in that process. So my interest was understanding a little bit more about what is humility and how do we ultimately develop it in others. So that's been my pursuit over the last decade. I think I have come down to a definition of humility being a proper perspective someone has of themselves, of the people that are in their lives, and the larger environment. And now that I see the world as it is, I think certainly the pandemic has given us a lot of humility. And I think some of the riots and some of the issues that are going on from a social perspective should be providing opportunities for us to be more humble and to learn more from that process. So it's just continued. My interest has continued. And I think as leadership continues, we're going to need to take on a real kind of humble perspective to leadership.
It's awesome. It reminds me of the concept of virtue, but it's something that allows us to be a lot closer to the leaders that we want to be, where we are very self-aware and we're virtuous, we're aspiring to and actually carrying out a discipline around the decisions that we make because they have real impact on people we love and people that we work with. So it's an area too that I think is a little bit, of one of those challenging ideas where, how do you incorporate it into your own life, right? So we could talk about it, we could read about it, but how do you like incorporate it into your leadership? And so it's something that I care about and want to continue to become, a more effective leader that, has congruence with what my outcomes are, as well as what my responsibilities are as a leader.
Yeah, so such a good point, Kris, because I think this idea of research and the research that I do, how it impacts what we actually practice, there's probably no more consistent findings in social psychological research than the idea that we really like ourselves, that we're overconfident. There's somebody watching this right now who's saying, yeah, I don't need coaching. I'm really doing great. Or, my team's perfect. We really got this figured out. And I love it because you're sitting here saying, like, I'm someone who's been tremendously successful, sold businesses for millions of, but I need coaching. I need that idea of humility in this process of continual learning. Once you start saying, I got this figured out, that's the moment you start on the decline in leadership. It's where you start the decline in your relationships. That constant need to learn more, grow more, experience more, understand more, and especially as it relates to leadership, could not be more important as it is right now. If you don't have a coach, if you're not practicing this idea of leadership development, you're getting away from those concepts of humility and how you develop yourself into a really great leader. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, and I appreciate the fact that you bring that into my life and into the life of my coworkers, because I think the closer we could become towards that, that aspirational ideal of being a truly great leader, the better and more impactful we'll be as leaders. But this 2020 has really been a year where two things. One, I think we're seeing, particularly in my own life through your coaching, and the importance of preparedness, right? So when stuff goes wrong, how you handle it is really going to dictate your outcome. How you make it through, how you weather the storm, how you are on the other side. We're still in a global pandemic. COVID-19 has resulted in a real challenge to businesses around the world. Can you chat a little bit more about some of the things that you've done to help leaders and managers kind of weather the storm, and any tips that you have? I mean, for the most part, people had to move to a remote work environment or they were laid off. So any tips or any thoughts that you have on that, Matt?
Yeah, I have been very busy talking about this idea of kind of switching mindsets or perspectives around kind of in the office leadership versus remote work leadership. And we've had a chance to talk about this, and certainly had a chance to do some training for those up in northeastern Pennsylvania and across the nation, to be honest. Probably have done 20, 25 different trainings around this topic of remote work environment with a couple thousand people to go through them. And the thing that I consistently say, and the thing I keep hearing back from people is, this has been eye-opening in how I've needed to change my leadership. I've needed to stop from this one-dimensional, one perspective of leadership that has kind of always just worked. It's been okay. I've been able to move to really reinventing their perspective on leadership, understanding that leadership is not a simple topic, and that the truth of it is there's a lot of different ways to view leadership. So in a lot of what I do is talking about, how do you view leadership? How do you ask the right questions when you're being a leader in that process? How do you address things from a structural standpoint? And how do you change those structures to address this new work environment? How do you handle individual employees and the needs that they have, the skills that they need to acquire right now to be more successful? Certainly, how do you build more culture, and how do you engage that culture as you're moving forward? So if we had a party for Dan when we were in the office because it was his birthday, how are you doing those similar things in the culture that's remote? And how do you continue to have history and engagement? One of the most important questions you want to ask yourself, I'll give you this tip right now, is a year from now, what are the stories that you want to be telling about your organization? And are you proud of those stories that you've told over the last 2 months? Or do you start now to develop those stories that 6 months from now, a year from now, you're really kind of engaging with in this process? And then finally, the politics behind it. How are you building out networks? How are you engaging people? And how are you moving from your own organization to embed kind of everything in that process?
Yep. Does the pandemic give us an opportunity to make sure that our sort of systems and operations are are effective, or in other words, prior to the pandemic, people were working in their work environments, which typically was a physical office. Now they're working remotely. Is this an opportunity to make sure that the systems that power that, having the right people in the right seats, making sure that there's clear role responsibility so that work's getting done? Do you have any ideas or any tips for people to think about? Because there is a high likelihood that even though most states are beginning to reopen, that we could end up in a position where we're in quarantine again at some point later this year. So is there something underlying what's driving an organization outside of the workspace?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely true to this idea of a second wave. I like the idea of being proactive as a leader. And with all the information we have now, is that there's probably going to be a second wave to this pandemic. Whether your state has opened up like Florida has to, just kind of opening the doors and letting everybody go, or a more slow approach like Pennsylvania, it's still going to be that we have a second wave of this. We're going to have to deal with this in one shape or another. So what do we learn from the first time we went through this that we ultimately can, address the second time a little bit better in that process? And I think the things that I am finding, especially from asking people, doing surveys around this, doing some research around this, is that communication becomes a really important process. How are we building out and empowering people from a communication standpoint? How are we helping each other in this process? I think the old adage that the leader is the end and everybody kind of has to focus up to the leader, allow the leader to be successful, communicate to the leader, that has certainly gone by the wayside at this point. It's the leader's responsibility to make sure that the employees or their culture feels less anxious during these times and engaged, and that everyone is really on the same page. It kind of goes back to those, what we know about really great leadership analogies of whether it's working in the military or great business leaders. In those really difficult times, leaders step up and they are not the central focus. They are the means to an end, and the end is helping others kind of move past that. So what are you doing proactively? And a lot of what we're talking about in our coaching sessions, and certainly what I talk to a lot of your employees about, is what are you working on now that's going to get you ready, be more proactive, allow you to hit that second wave? Or if the second wave doesn't happen, how's it going to make you more proactive just in your leadership and your perception, no matter what? How do you run better meetings? How are you having strategic plans? And ultimately, how are you holding yourself accountable to be extraordinary? And that's kind of the end of this.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, no, I agree. So what I thought we would do is each of us would have some sort of closing thoughts. And if you don't mind, I'll start.
I love that.
So, for folks that know me, you guys know how dedicated I've been throughout my whole life to this concept of personal and professional development. But I will tell you what, I've read a lot of books and I've self-educated, but nothing has been more profound in my development as a leader than bringing you on, Matt. And I want to thank you for that. And, I could really thank you on behalf of the LSEO team, who's benefited from, from your ability to come in and help us become greater leaders. So thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. But, for folks watching, I think it really comes down to accountability, right? Entrepreneurship sometimes feels like a train that's kind of left the station and we're trying to catch up to the train. When if we just take a deep breath and we step back and we think about the responsibility that we have around personal and professional development, to constantly get better at what we're trying to achieve, but realizing that it can't be just like a desire. We've got to go from, a lot of entrepreneurs get into entrepreneurship out of desire, but then realize that there's a lot of specific skills that are required. So the thing I wanted to say was, I really encourage my entrepreneurial friends and executive friends that are out there to hold yourself accountable to identifying and acquiring key leadership and management skills that will not only allow you to become a better leader, but really prepare you for when times are tough. So, and again, in my case, I was able to become a better leader over time through self-education, but nothing has been as profound as, Dr. Matt Sowcik coming into my life and really showing me that you could really accelerate that learning process by identifying the specific skills that other leaders have used to get through all types of decision making. So Matt, I just want to thank you and want to encourage everybody that's watching this to really set some goals around skill acquisition as it relates to leadership and management. And so you've got some of your own closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would echo that, Kris. I really appreciate those kind words, and I think it's interesting in our culture. We feel really comfortable going to the doctors. We know every 6 months we probably should go for a checkup. What if you just waited until something terrible had happened, and that was the only time you went to the doctors? And maybe there's somebody out there who just does that, and you know the risks of that. I think the same is true with this coaching, with the leadership development piece. Is you can wait until your organization's in dire straits. You can wait until you have that really difficult relationship, or you can wait until many leaders that I work with talked about where their advisors, their board come in and say, hey, we're going to have to let you go. And Steve Jobs is a great example of this. We got to let you go. You created this company, but you're just a real jerk. Like, you don't have these leadership development skills. You don't have this. He had talked about it, and I love that. He said that the worst tasting medicine that he appreciates he ever took was this idea of humility. And from that humility, he grew that business, as you know, just exponentially in that process. I think the truth is in each of our lives, whether you own a business, whether you're an employee, your development is consistent, and you need to check in on that. And you should be checking in on that pretty regularly. If you just wait until it's too late, we all know the outcome of that it's often too late to save at that point in time. So if you have a coach, if you have someone, or just reach out to, I know Wilkes, King's, there's some amazing professors in your area. There is amazing universities throughout this nation. There's great consultants throughout this nation. Certainly reach out to me. If you want to know a little bit more about your own development, how to move forward, and engaging in the next steps that'll make you kind of extraordinary as a leader, I think it's really, really important. And I find that those people who have the humility to be able to challenge themselves to do that certainly live happier, healthier, but more successful lives in that process. So I really appreciate your kind words. This has been awesome. Couldn't be a better podcast. I've watched all of them. Yeah, and you're doing good stuff, Kris, and I am just so happy to work with you on that.
Matt, thank you so much. For those that are watching, in next week's podcast, I will have the head of Snapchat for Canada, good friend of mine by the name of Matt McGowan. He'll share his story, and he'll give you guys some tips and strategies for how to become the best version of yourself. Dr. Sowcik, thank you so much. And my friend, thank you.
Awesome.